Hello, my name is Frédéric Julien. I am joining you today from Gatineau in Canada on the traditional territories of the Anishinaabe Omami Wininiwak Nation. I was hoping to join you today with my colleagues Brit and Andrew. Andrew had a conflict, long-standing conflict, and could not be there, but I still wanted to acknowledge her role in the findings that I'll be sharing today. Brit, my Indigenous colleague, chose not to attend. I fully respect her decision, but I wanted to acknowledge her decision because her decision highlights the intimidating aspects that or perception that Indigenous people may have of Wikidata. She's a wonderful person, a brave person. She chose not to come in because she said, these are not my people. And I respect her decision. So there I am, a white man, 10th generation settler, whose mother tongue is French, a colonial language, speaking to you using English, another colonial language. Just feels, well, that's just what it is. So let me situate what I'm going to share with you. I'm going to share some preliminary findings of a project that started now roughly 2 years ago as an adjunct to a larger initiative called the Linked Digital Future Initiative. It just happened as a necessity because as we were trying to define a linked open data ecosystem for the performing arts, we had to make sure that there was a place for indigenous artists and their works into this ecosystem. So we did research back in 2019, which involved a bunch of individual consultations, but then we thought that we needed to undertake a more exhaustive process and consulting with non-Wikidata experts, non-data experts, talking to knowledge, to domain experts, knowledge keepers within the Indigenous community. So we held a first group consultation back in February. Then we did user acceptance testing, or we borrowed the methodology and we did one-on-one activities in Wikidata in which we guided Indigenous artists as they were themselves making statements in Wikidata. Most of what I'm going to share with you is about those findings. We are about to do group consultations, further group consultations. I was hoping that we might be able to hold them before WikidataCon, but just didn't happen that way. And there will be some reporting that will come out of this project, although I don't anticipate that the reporting will mean the end of the project. I cannot see the chat right now. Let me just make sure that I can turn on the chat in my other computer. If you have any questions for me, please drop them in the chat. I'll try to address them as they come in. So let's begin with citizenship. If you're a new Wikimedia user and you're creating an item for yourself as a person, one of the first things that Wikidata invites you to populate is your country of citizenship. That can be an uncomfortable or even upsetting experience for an indigenous person whose nation was oppressed, and let's use the word like there was a systemic organized genocide in Canada against indigenous people. So that's not a finding, that's just a reality, but it has to be said, because that can be a stumbling block right there that can make an indigenous person say, okay, that's it, Wikidata, I've had enough with you. How can we state in Wikidata that a person is indigenous? That is a critical question, because if we want to be able to query Wikidata to retrieve their works, to retrieve the organizations that are led by indigenous people, we need to be able to state indigeneity or belonging to some indigenous nation. Right now, the only property that we have is ethnic group. But nation is a broader concept than ethnic group. Nation involves belonging to a nation in the sense of citizenship. Now, these aren't state nation, but they are considered nation and nation that are entitled to self-determination as such. When we asked people to state their ethnic group in Wikidata, we explained to them what the term means, because I was anticipating that the label itself might not be eliciting a positive response. So explain what the definition for it is. Turns out that no one was upset with the notion of ethnic group and stating ethnicity. What was surprising, though, is that some of our participants chose not to name their actual nation as the value, but they said, well, if ethnic group is a group that I belong to based on language and on customs, then my ethnic group is not my nation. It's my larger Anishinaabe family of nation, or else Cree. So that was interesting. But then, you know, nations, they're a broader concept, but the thing is, they are modeled by using subclasses relationships, and they are modeled as being smaller, narrower entities than ethnic group or larger groups like Crees. That's just one finding. We haven't resolved that, but I'll be revisiting the hierarchies of nations in Wikidata. I won't go though into making addressing challenges around items that that can conflate or confuse a nation with a language, a nation with a band, which is a government structure in Canada, a nation with a reserve. Sometimes labels and descriptions are just off, and like there's a whole lot of cleaning that needs to happen before we can actually state things. Oh gosh, I see that the chat is active. That's great, but I think I'll have to keep going and revisit your questions later on. So one important thing that we have to do also is making sure that we can state the indigeneity of artistic and cultural practices. Now, as we did those one-on-one tests, sometimes it was very easy because the artists with whom we were working could easily just type in and retrieve a, you know, Western centric discipline that they were totally fine using as a value for their work. But sometimes their practices were specific to their indigenous culture. So one example was, some examples include beadworking, for example, but then also a bunch of dances that are specific to indigenous cultures. And one of them that was yielded a particular reaction was Native American hoop dance. The person who was attempting to state hoop dance says, well, I'm just doing hoop dance. I'm not doing Native American hoop dance. I'm not Native American. You know, my nation, their traditional territories, they're not in the place that you people in the United States call America. So that's just not right. And I said, okay, good. So let's look at that. Turns out that oftentimes in Wikidata, we are importing information from Wikipedia, but the naming conventions of Wikipedia and the naming conventions in Wikidata, they're not the same. In Wikipedia, we have to use the most common name, and we have to make sure that we provide disambiguation information in the name of the article. In Wikidata, however, disambiguation doesn't belong in the name of the item. It belongs in the description. It belongs in the statements. So I said, simple, we'll just remove Native American and we'll make sure that the description is a description that you think is an apt, accurate description of your practice, which is what we did. But as I was preparing for this session, I realized that someone reverted that change and Native American came back. So I guess I'll have to go and undo this and explain in a gentle manner that according to how people name this practice and according to the Wikidata naming conventions, this article shall be from now on named Who Dance. We'll see how that goes. So how can we also denote that a given practice is indigenous? You know, it's a good thing to have the right name for it. That's absolutely important. It's a good thing to have a description that indigenous practitioners deem accurate and respectful. But, you know, if there's no data point that can tell us that this actual practice is indigenous, then it cannot be queried as such. So we need data that can be queried and reused and processed. So how can we do that? Of course, we could use a subclass and have a superclass of all indigenous artistic and cultural practices. But that concept doesn't exist, so it's not logical as a solution. Culture, good pick. That could be a fine example, and we won't go into showing actual examples, but in those slides that you can revisit, you can see how it's been used in certain items. Culture is a fine choice, but is it absolutely suited to all practices with context? I mean, it works well for traditional practices, but how about contemporary practices? And indigenous too is used sometimes, as you see here on the screen, with a value being indigenous peoples of the Americas, which is wrong from because the property indigenous to its value should be some land, some geographic area. So there remains facet of, which is a property that I like, because facet of says this is one facet of this multifaceted thing. However, some of the values that exist around in Wikidata are still tainted with colonial label. Art of Amerindian peoples. I don't know. I'll keep my comments to myself. How about organizations? You know, when we work with one of our participants who said, okay, how can I state that my organization is indigenous? You know, we've stated that in the description. She quickly got that there had to be a way to state this using data. Actually, no, not yet. We haven't figured out. So subclass, possible, but you know, defining a superclass for all indigenous organizations, not an easy task. Field of work, that would be great. But then that brings us back to the challenge of defining indigenous artistic and cultural practices. So we lack a means of stating that an organization is indigenous. Same problem occurs with works. We need subject headings that might help identify at least works that are about aspects of indigenous cultures, and libraries are actively working on that topic, thankfully. I said that I would briefly touch upon querying indigenous people using ethnic group statement, which is a challenge because some relationships are stated using the subclass property. Others are stated using the part of property, which, you know, it's possible to write a query that will retrieve both. But someone who's not aware might run a query and miss out on quite a few people. It's a problem that I cannot solve myself. I have no right to decide how these things should be modeled. My only role as an ally to my indigenous colleagues is help flag that this particular fact implies limitations on how this data can be used and how people can discover Indigenous artists and their works. And that is it. And I have to say, I feel a bit emotional having done this on my own as the only white man presenting. So getting it out. Questions? Let's go into the chat, or if you feel like turning your mic on, please go right ahead. Or if someone has been keeping an eye on the chat and can help me summarize the discussions that have been going on in there, that would be great. The only presenter, I feel like I have a lot to catch in this chat. So Mike points out it'll be interested to see similarities and differences between modeling Indigenous peoples of Canada and New Zealand. Absolutely. So in Canada, we have different groups of nations, the First Nations, the Inuit, the Métis people, and in New Zealand, you have the larger Maori and this other word that I actually don't even know how to pronounce. So, you know, how do we deal with that? And I was actually having an exchange over email with a colleague of mine in New Zealand. And, you know, towards the end, the only thing that we settled on is to state both the Maori value and the Iwi tribe value using ethnic group. But is there a better way? Possibly. And yeah, Paolo, every time I feel that ethnic group field, I have a feeling of being one of those correspondents of the geographic societies. That is a real problem. And I can speak to it as a white man. Who am I to decide which value should be ascribed to a given person's indigenous ethnic group? Especially now that I realize that some people will have a preference to state a larger ethnic group rather than their nation, then I have to be really careful. I should not go about making those decisions myself. But the problem is, you know, even if I wanted to state the larger ethnic group, oftentimes when you look at biographies of Indigenous artists, they will state their nation and sometimes even their clan, but not the larger ethnic group. Now you can make the inference, but still it's not up to me to decide how a given person should identify as Indigenous. But then who should? And if no one does, then are we failing our Indigenous colleagues? These are profound ethical dilemmas that I'm dealing with, and I do this by consulting with my Indigenous colleagues to, if at least we cannot arrive to some consensus on how to do this, guide them so that they can do it themselves. There, right? Is it that there should be a choice among citizenship, state, nation, identity, ethnic group, and mix and match? I don't know. Personally, I think it would be a good thing to propose to Indigenous people a property that speaks to how they define themselves, and that, you know, that property should be nation, with a clear description that this nation, this particular nation property describes nations for Indigenous nations of North America or of Turtle Island. But anyways, these discussions are happening among Indigenous peoples in Canada, thankfully, and they may at some point arrive on a decision about this. My only role is to ask the question and guide my colleagues in finding the right answer. Well, Jane, you touch upon something really, really important. Yeah, indigenous people are just like white people in the sense that they don't classify themselves. But that is also part of a movement of self-affirmation at least in Canada, wherein people are invited to state all of their identities, not only their indigenous nations. So you will see in many items about indigenous artists in Canada that those who took the time to self-identify will have stated all of their ethnicities, not only their indigenous nation. And so I did the same. I added French Canadian as an ethnic group on my Wikidata item. Kelly, yeah, I mentioned decolonial English earlier. What are your thoughts? So when people, at least within that very small sample, and I have to be very specific, like these one-on-one tests that we did was with 5 indigenous artists. So it's a small sample. Hence the need for more consultations, and so we can validate these initial findings. When artists were, because we were inviting them to type in and populate the information themselves rather than us doing it on their behalf. So they would type in the name of their nation using their endonym, how they themselves call the nation, and couldn't find it. They had to revert to exonyms, name given to their nation by colonial people. So that was obviously a stumbling block for these people, and some few more minutes. Okay. And some of them said, you know, why shouldn't we be able to force in terms of the string for the names, force the use of the name of the nation as this nation calls itself? And I said, well, that's not how Wikidata is designed. It's not designed like that. You know, we need to rewrite stuff. And then my colleague Brit said, well, what? Then do it. And I said, you're right. Perhaps it's time to rewrite some code in Wikidata so that the most commonly used name for an indigenous nation is no longer an English name that has no connection with how these people call themselves. So much happening in the chat. Would anyone like to turn on their mic and provide a closing thought? It's a topic with which I'm profoundly engaged. Jane, Jan, you phrase it like the participants didn't like to describe themselves in a certain way. Do you think it would have been different if it wouldn't have been about them personally, instead about someone else? I would presume that many Indigenous artists, knowing the inadequacy of the ethnic group property, would be careful and would prefer not to make a statement about their colleagues' ethnicity for themselves. I think they would be, sensitive and would likely do like I do, which is, it's not up to me. At least until we have a nation property, I cannot simply use a bio and say ethnic group equals. I would be able to say nation equal, but I cannot use ethnic group in this fashion. Our time is up. I want to be mindful of the fact that there's another session happening in this room very soon. And I will reread the chat. I want to thank you for all of the thoughts that you shared in here. Merci.